Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Brown here today. Today's lesson is to give you a little bit of background on Charles Dickens, a little bit about his life and times, some of the things that were most important to him, and the things that had the biggest influence on his writing. It's difficult to find another author in any country or any language who wrote as many books and as many famous books with as great storytellings and has had as wide an influence as Charles Dickens. So the things to keep in mind as we go through this lesson today is what can you learn from Dickens and his work, and how can we apply what we get out of reading Great Expectations to our lives today? So what is the big deal about Charles Dickens? Well, one of the things is just the number of books that he wrote, the number of quality books that he wrote. He wrote 15 major novels in addition to some other short stories and other types of work in a career that spanned 33 years. So if you do the math, that's about one book every 2 years. It's hard, we'd be hard put even today to find another author, maybe a Stephen King or a J.K. Rowling, who has managed to maintain that level of productivity and quality in their work. Really, about Charles Dickens' only rival would be somebody like William Shakespeare. If you're going to look in terms of the memorable characters that he wrote, the kinds of villains and plots that were created, and just the general creativity and quality of the literature. Now, Charles Dickens was much more than just a popular author. He was very much a crusader, an activist for the social issues of the day, particularly issues related to children. As we'll talk about in a minute, some of this ties into Charles Dickens' own experience as a child, but he was very much a crusader for children's rights in a time when kids had no rights at all. He wanted to work on repealing some of the child labor laws. He opposed some of the punishments and things that were fairly common for children in those days, and he believed in and lobbied for just treatment of even people and criminals and in jails. So he was really someone who worked for a lot of the underprivileged and underrepresented populations of his time. So how did Dickens fight these issues? Another man of the time might have run for political office or tried to donate money. Dickens used what he did best, which was his writing. And he used the writing to protest what he saw as this greedy, uncaring, materialistic society. He called his writing a sledgehammer that he was really using through the characters and the events of the story to get people to care about these things and to kind of wake up to what was going on in the world around them. And he was very effective at using satire to highlight the problems from the society in his day. One of the Charles Dickens stories that you're probably already pretty familiar with is A Christmas Carol. And A Christmas Carol is a great introduction to the world of Charles Dickens because it kind of gets to a lot of those issues that he tries to deal with on the bigger novels as well. In them, one of the characters who comes back from the dead to tell our hero, antagonist that turns into the protagonist, Ebenezer Scrooge, who's spending way too much time worrying about collecting money and taking care of business, that mankind should have been his business, and that the things that he should have been dealing with are the ignorance and want in this case refers to needs, the things that people don't have, the basic everyday supplies to just keep on living, that were lacking so much in the world around him. By the time Charles Dickens died, he'd already achieved a level of fame and respect that's, again, ranks right up there with the greatest authors of England. He's buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and his epitaph reads, "He was a sympathizer to the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed, and by his death, one of England's greatest writers is lost to the world." One of the things that gave so much passion and reality to his stories was that much of his writing was actually autobiographical in nature. He lived in London. He went through a lot of the situations and places that his characters experience in the books. Now, much like in earlier lessons, we talked about that relationship and parallel careers of Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare. Charles Dickens also had a kind of a parallel career with the rise of Queen Victoria. Dickens published his very first book in 1837, which was Oliver Twist. It was hugely popular. It was a serial novel, so it was published bit by bit, and it was very close to his own personal story, so it was very autobiographical. Queen Victoria took the throne at the very young age of 18, and she died in 1901 after 64 years of being queen, and after establishing what we think of today as the greatest time of the British Empire. You can actually continue a number of comparisons between Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria. She was not only Queen of England, was also titled Empress of India. She became the longest reigning British monarch of any kind, male or female. And over this long reign, we saw these huge changes in society, just through technology and science, that were encouraged and able to grow and be developed underneath the peace and stability and the material wealth that the British Empire was able to achieve under Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert had 9 children, 4 boys and 5 girls. And through marrying off all of these children, forged all of these connections through Britain with almost every European monarchy, and was one of the things that did help the British Empire reach its grandest scale. And she was so popular for so long and so effective as a leader that her name became synonymous with this entire age and style. We talk about the Victorian times, the Victorian styles. To quote from one of the most famous first lines of any book ever, Charles Dickens says in his opening to A Tale of Two Cities, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Dickens, underneath this reign of Queen Victoria, lived during a period of extreme contradictions. Victorian England saw this great rise in invention in industry and technology, but the working conditions were sheer misery. It was a rise of great education and science, the opening of universities, more people being educated, at the same time that so much of what was being accomplished in society was being done on the back of child labor. It was a time of the Victorian morality and propriety, all of these proper things that ladies and lords would do, and that was all on the surface, but underneath, the society ran on greed, bribe, and all kinds of double standards. There really was a huge division between the upper class and the lower class, a great separation. On one hand, you had your high society with all of their different outfits and clothing and various traditions and styles for things that had to happen at every hour of the day, and servants to wait on them hand and foot and take care of all of these. And these fine lords and ladies, while they were out making their rounds of their social calls and teas, would often walk right by incredibly deep misery and suffering in the streets. London became one of the biggest capitals of the world, as a place of center of industry, a center of business, a center of society, a center of the arts. And if you had money, wealth, and social status, London was also a place of non-stop parties and social scenes. Ladies would spend their entire day going from house to house visiting each other, and then spend their evening in cards or in playing music soirees or throwing lavish dinner parties. Gentlemen would do much the same, perhaps with card parties and various trips to clubs and things thrown in. However, if you didn't have money, wealth, or social status, you were probably working, and the working conditions were horrific. This is the start of the Industrial Revolution, and there's almost no such thing as a labor law. The businessmen employed the people, they set the tone, say, here's what the work is, here's what we pay, if you don't like it, you don't have a job. And there was nothing that the government did to protect workers or people. So you get this extreme contrast between the haves and the have-nots. You may have heard the expression, the sun never set on the British Empire. People from Britain, the Britain government controlled all of these different locations that literally span the globe, every continent, so that as the sun would rise and move across the world, almost any place that the sun was shining on was part of British territory and British rule. The sun also never set on things like child labor. This picture here is what they call a hurrier. These were small children who were used in the coal mines because they were short. They could fit down in the tunnels, and they were used to push the coal back and forth, up and down, all day long and all night long. They would work 7-hour day or 7 days a week, and they would work pretty much from sun up to sundown. And this could be children as young as 3 or 4 years old. One of the things that Dickens did manage to achieve in his lifetime that many authors never get was this extreme popularity within the time that he was alive. Dickens' greatest friendship was, from the beginning, with his audience. He had a way of making these stories of misery and greed and corruption into things that people really cared about, into characters that they got to know, and into stories that have stayed with us for many, many, many years now.